Order, order. I will call Damien Collins to move the motion, and I will then call the Minister to respond. There will not be an opportunity for the member in charge to wind up, as is the convention for 30-minute debates. Order, order. Damien Collins to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think the fact that we have so many members seeking to intervene or speak in this very short debate shows what a great deal of interest there is in this topic. And the subject of brain injuries in football and concussion and brain injuries in sport as a whole has received considerable attention in recent months, but I believe it's an issue we've been familiar with for many years. My wife's grandfather, a man called George Richardson, who played professional football for Sheffield United and Hull City, died in 1968, aged just 56, from a brain hemorrhage, but was widely believed in the family that it was a consequence of him having headed heavy footballs, playing as a striker in the Football League in his youth. In 1966, obviously that famous year for the England World Cup win, but it was also the end of the first domestic season where injury substitutions were allowed in English football. And that year, in a report I read in the Liverpool Echo, it was recorded that 772 injury substitutions had been made, of which over 10% were made as a consequence of concussion or head injuries. See, the vast majority were for leg injuries, quite understandable for football, but even then, quite a high number of players that were taken off for concussion. And you can imagine what a high bar that probably would have been at that time, with the understanding of the consequences of concussion and the long-term health impacts probably not being as well understood. But staying in 1966, 5 members of that England World Cup winning team have subsequently died as a consequence of dementia or brain-related conditions. Recently, other well-known England footballers and Scotland footballers like Jeff Astle, Gordon McQueen, Joe Kinnear have also died from brain-related injuries. But this is no longer just a matter of tragic stories being brought into the public domain, great loss and sympathy with the families concerned, but also increasing scientific study, and particularly in Scotland with the field study conducted by Dr. Willie Stewart, which looked in 2019 at the cases and causes of death of over 7,000 former Scottish professional footballers, looking at their cause of death against a study of the general population involving 23,000 people. Good for it, John.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Member, and let me congratulate him on getting this debate. And I think he's raising a very important point about that field study in Scotland. And of course, I think at the time, by some people it was dismissed because it was only one study. But what's changed in the intervening years, there have been studies in other European countries as well. The evidence, I would argue, is now overwhelming. And what we really need to do is to make sure the high-profile cases that you talked about, the members talked about, but there are also thousands of footballers that are caught up in this, in financial difficulty. And what we really need is that understanding, based on the scientific evidence, that this needs to be classed as an industrial injury by the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council.
Yep.
Damien Collins.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He makes an incredibly important point. I will just dwell briefly on, the main statistical outputs from the field study, though, as well, because I think it is the best baseline study we have in the UK. And the figures are quite stark, that they discovered that former footballers had a 5-fold increase in Alzheimer's disease, a 4-fold increase in motor neuron disease, a 2-fold increase in Parkinson's disease against the base level for the population. And further medical studies have also identified the medical condition of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, which is linked to head trauma, head injury, which could be caused by a severe blow to the head, but also within the course of playing football as well. It causes a release within the brain that is made worse by repetitive injury as well. And that's why I think the point that the Right Honourable Gentleman makes about looking at classifying this as a form of industrial injury that is caused by the circumstances of playing football and can have prolonged and lasting effects. And even players that have received concussion injuries on several occasions may be more likely to have severe trauma later on, even if it's recognised at the time. I'll give way.
First of all, can I commend the Honourable Gentleman, Madam Chair, for bringing this forward. It's a subject that's been in this House for some time, and I commend him for his zeal to try and make it happen. There has been, of course, some advances and helpful discussions in relation to the IFA, and I make this for us and indeed back home. Does the Honourable Member not agree that the lessons learned have meant changes must be made, including the pilot scheme which was introduced by the IFA in 2020 to allow substitutions for suspected concussion, with no disadvantage to the teams, meaning that players don't feel they have to shake it off, but indeed can be medically wise. There are some things that can be done. So every debate we bring forward, Madam Chair, it's important to highlight the issues. It's also important to highlight the possible solutions.
I agree with the Honourable Gentleman. I think concussion substitutions would be a sensible measure. I believe in Scotland they have a campaign for rugby, if in doubt, sit it out. I think to recognise the danger of concussion injuries, to allow a pause from play. Often the incentives within professional sport are to keep people playing as long as possible, and often the players want that themselves. But sometimes you have to have proper safety standards so that the right decision is made and it doesn't lead to lasting injury and trauma. In the United States of America, the recognition of CTE as an injury caused by playing professional sport, particularly American football, is well recognised. And the NFL is providing hundreds of millions of dollars of support for players who are diagnosed as having recognised as having CTE. The recognition of the link between head injury and playing sport is recognised, and people are properly supported and compensated. And that, I think, is the challenge we have to look at here. Two things. One is, how can we prevent unnecessary injury and lasting injury as a consequence of head injuries and brain injuries in football and other sports? And how do we support people who late in life are suffering as a consequence of these injuries they sustained during their playing career? The question of compensation is one that families in particular have raised. And whilst a fund has been created by the Premier League, administered by the PFA, £1 million fund, the concerns are that, firstly, there is no guarantee that beyond the first year of its operation, which we're still in, that this fund will continue, although we hope that it will. But that it needs to have proper resources and also be properly accessible to families. I spoke recently to the son of Nobby Stiles, a former England footballer, John Stiles, who made it clear to me that in his father's case, his care costs a year were over £100,000, and yet the cap for funding from the current fund is £60,000 a year. So it wouldn't be enough. In the case, Nobby Stiles decided to sell his medals, including his World Cup winning medal, and that helped pay for his retirement and his costs. But not everyone is in that position. Many other footballers and their families can be in a position where they're required to sell the family home, something that when this fund was created, they were told would not be the case. But some former players have had to sell their homes or their families out. I give way to the Honourable Member.
The Honourable Member for giving way on that particular point about the funding. I raised this in the House last week because my constituent is Chris Sutton, the former Celtic, Chelsea and Blackburn, but of course more importantly Norwich City legend, being in Norfolk. Currently there is support in place from the PFA and the Premier League's Brain Health Fund, and that's already paid out thousands and thousands to help families, which is positive, but a proper registered charity would be the way forward to have the funding in place to actually bring this forward. Do you think the Minister could help with putting that vehicle in place to really be the proper vehicle to help support?
Collins.
Grateful to the Honourable Member. I'm sure the Minister has heard the point that he has made, and I certainly think the Minister's convening power could be extremely helpful in this case. There needs to be a properly resourced fund that football pays into. There is enough money in football to provide this compensation for players that clearly need it. And even though the fund, as I mentioned before, the cap on the fund could mean it will not cover some care costs. It wouldn't have done in the case of Nobby Stiles had it existed at that time. Other deaths of former players recently. Chris Nicol, former player for Aston Villa and Southampton, he died without his family receiving a penny of funding there. John McNamee, similarly former Newcastle player, died as a consequence of CTE, and they had to sell the family home to cover care costs. So there are real concerns being raised by the families that, limited though these funds are, they are not universally accessible, and there's no guarantee that they will exist in the future.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and congratulating him on securing the debate. I think the points have been made about the Brain Health Fund are incredibly important, but does my honourable friend think it's important also that actually it's not just the Premier League, it's not just the Professional Footballers Association, but it's also the FA and the EFL that play a part in this, and actually by all coming together, all partners and hopefully government as well, actually we can deliver so much more for players today and into the future.
Collins.
I completely agree with my right honourable friend. I think, whilst there is criticism from the families about the fund that does exist, it has been created voluntarily by them. The EFL and the FA are not part of that, and they need to be. all the groups that represent professional football need to be together to providing this support fund. I agree with what the right honourable gentleman said earlier, that we should look at classifying this as an industrial injury, but also I don't think football needs to wait for that classification. More could be being done now to put these elements in place. And this is where I look to the Minister. I know that this has been raised with him before, and he's taken a keen interest in this subject. But I do think the government can play a role in bringing these parties together. I think there should be a recognition of the link. Whilst there will be more research being done, and I know that his department is supporting more research and convening a forum to decide where the areas for priority research should be, that will help us in the future and will help us understand the way in which we can safeguard young players playing sports today and safeguard against brain injuries for the future. But there does need to be more done now to recognise the link that exists, to accept that and to accept a responsibility. And I think there's a danger sometimes people are concerned about legal liabilities. But the knowledge of this has existed for a while. In March this year, Dan Roan of the BBC published a report showing that FA board minutes from 1983 recognised the concern about head injuries and brain injuries and the causal link between playing football. So let's not pretend this has not been known about. But something needs to be done now. Now, I would ask the Minister whether he thinks he can play a role in trying to bring the FA and the Football League together with the Premier League and the PFA to agree a package of financial support which makes the fund that is available sustainable, to look at lifting the cap above £60,000 a year, to guarantee that no family will ever have to sell the family home to pay for care costs for former footballers, and that football will accept its responsibility to care for these heroes of the past who've incurred their injuries whilst giving entertainment and joy to millions of people, and also enriching other people that have made money out of the game. I raised yesterday in the debates on the second reading of the Football Regulator Bill, I think there is a case for looking at player welfare as part of the remit of the regulator. I don't think the regulator's job should be to write rules for football, but I think it should be there to make sure that competition organisers and clubs themselves adhere to the standards that have been set by those competitions themselves with regard to athlete and player welfare. I believe that will be consistent with the corporate governance responsibilities that the regulator sets. And indeed, in terms of funding support for players in need in late life with their care costs, indeed, it could be another one of the opportunities where the fines collected by the regulator could support both grassroots sport and legacy injuries related to football, particularly brain injuries as well. That fund could be used helpfully in that way. But I do think there's enough money in football that primarily the professional football organisations themselves should set that standard. And then finally, as has been raised already in this debate, the question of the rules that govern concussion in sport and brain injuries and head injuries in sport today are really important. I don't want to see things like heading the ball removed as part of football. Football is a physical game and is enjoyed as such. But players should be aware of the risks they are running, and there should be safety standards, maybe potentially to ensure either concussion substitutions during matches or training, that people are sat out when they've clearly had a head injury and given a proper amount of time to recover. And there also should be a consideration about unnecessary repetitive exercises of heading the ball in training are really necessary if they do cause damage. And these things need to be properly understood. There are some things there where more research may well be needed, and we will look at this on an ongoing basis. But I think as a start point, recognising the link that exists, recognise the genuine need of support that some former players and their families have now. Football, I think, already respects that this does exist as a connection, but there is a proper agreement to resource this, to make sure the support is there, to make sure the fund is ongoing. And I would ask, as the Minister, as he considers the regulator bill going through the House, that we consider the role the regulator can play in ensuring that the welfare and safety standards that we should expect from clubs and competition organisers are actually followed through.
Question is that this House has considered brain injuries in football. I call the Minister to respond.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this morning, and I'd like to thank my honourable friend for Folkestone and Hythe for securing time for this important debate. I'm under no illusion of the significant interest that honourable and right honourable members have in this issue, and the fact that so many colleagues are here for a half-hour debate shows that prove that point. The issue of brain injuries in football obviously is very important and touches the hearts of many people. And last September's backbench debate on the links between football and neurodegenerative disease demonstrated, I think, the party-wide support that there is in this issue. and the depth of feeling about the vital issue in the House, as was well as wider society, and that is reflected by the many personal stories of constituents that honourable members have raised. I'll happily give way.
I'm very grateful for the Minister in giving way and to making that reference to the debate that we had on the 14th of September. And as he rightly said, it was a cross-party debate led by myself, the member for Murray and the member for Easington, and I was very encouraged by the response of the government front bench at that point. Subsequent to that, I had, on behalf of the three of us, had discussions with the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council, and there's that recognition about the wealth of evidence that now exists. But what we do now need is some help from a government minister to take that to the next level. The previous minister that moved on had indicated that he would have a meeting with the three of us, and I've been trying to push the replacement minister, by letter I wrote to her on the 18th of January and the 13th of March, if the minister can perhaps assist us in making sure that we can get that meeting, and for the benefit of all of us that were engaged in that debate and the debate today, that we can try and make sure that we do the right thing, that we don't have more John McNamee's, who was a Hibs as well as a Newcastle legend, facing the kind of financial injustice that they had done.
Well, it was certainly a pleasure to respond to that debate, and I made that commitment to write to the department, which I did. I was due to meet the minister, the disabled minister, yesterday, but of course I had to spend all day in the chamber for the second reading of the Football Governance Bill. But that meeting will be rearranged, and I'll be sure to raise that at that point. But I'll come on to the industrial injuries part shortly. The safety, well-being and welfare of everyone taking part in sport is, of course, absolutely paramount. And on top of that, I know how important football clubs and players are to all of our local communities. The recent examples of dementia-related deaths of former footballers are, of course, of great concern to members across this House and, of course, to me as the Minister for Sport. And the vast majority of people, it is important to acknowledge, do play sport safely. But we know that head injuries in sport do, of course, occur. And player safety must be a major focus for sport. As we recently highlighted in our government sports strategy, Get Active. But, of course, the more work is still needed to ensure that robust measures are in place to reduce that risk and improve the diagnosis and management of sport-related head injuries at all levels of sport. And this should not just apply during matches, but also during training, and there should be provision for both professional and amateur players, as honourable members have mentioned. Now, of course, sports national governing bodies are rightly responsible for the regulation of their sport and for ensuring that appropriate measures are in place to protect participants from serious injuries. And I'm pleased to say that positive progress has been made in areas across different sports in recent years. For example, home nation football associations have changed their guidelines to prevent under-11s heading footballs during training in England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and the FA is also co-funding research with the PFA to build the evidence base related to brain injuries in football. So it's not just it is not just national governing bodies contributing to improvements in player safety. So player associations such as the PFA also play a valuable role in supporting professional players and providing short and long-term support to those affected by sporting injuries. Yes?
I'm very grateful. I mean, he mentions the fact that further work is being done by the FA, but in his mind, is there a doubt in the mind of the Minister and the mind of the government of this link between brain injury and sporting injury?
Well, I'm going to come on to research in a minute and to some of the things I want to take from this debate. But members have mentioned the brain health team and the range of support to former players and their families, which includes, of course, assistance with claiming state support and benefits. And I have discussed this work of player welfare with the PFA's chief executive, and including around the Football Brain Health Fund for players impacted by dementia. As has been mentioned, that was established last year with the aim of providing financial support for players. And as has also been mentioned, an initial amount of £1 million has been made available to provide that discretionary financial support as assessed by an independent panel to help improve quality of life. As the first of its kind for English football, I welcome the creation of this fund and I hope it will provide support to those former players who need it most. The PFA have also confirmed that further investment will be forthcoming, but I will, of course, make sure that I seek further reassurances for that fund. However, I do acknowledge that there is some scepticism from former footballers who have contacted me to express doubts about the fund's effectiveness, and I'll happily give way to my right honourable friend.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Would it be possible, actually, in terms of his representations, if maybe he also approaches the FA and the EFL in terms of the work that's been done in terms of the Brain Health Fund? But also I wondered if he would able to take the time, because it's been mentioned a number of times about the issue of temporary concussion substitutions. Now, this isn't a decision that will be made by the FA or the Scottish Football Association, but is actually made by the International Football Association Board, of which the largest component of that is FIFA. And I wondered if you'd be able to use his office and his position to make representations to both FIFA and the International Football Association Board to actually make the voice of home associations properly heard and actually action taken to introduce temporary concussion substitutions.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for that intervention, as I say, I've had those letters from former footballers expressing concern about the fund, and so I wrote just yesterday to the PFA to seek assurances that the fund is working. But I recognise there's wider work to be done here, and I'll be more than happy to convene a meeting or roundtable, if you like, with all of the interested bodies and reflect the comments that honourable and right honourable members have made today, and I will include, of course, FIFA.
Right honourable friends, as part of, I'm very glad to hear that. Would it, whether it's that roundtable or a subsequent one, would he also meet with the families as well, who are raising these concerns about the practical operation of these funds and the difficulty of accessing them?
No, I'd be more than happy to do that. In fact, I would suggest it's probably sensible to do that before we do the roundtable, so I can reflect what I've heard from those families. Just moving on to the Industrial Injuries Disability Fund. I know that there has been discussion about this, and I just want to update that, of course, DWP provides the specific support for this specific benefit, and the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council are the independent scientific body which will make recommendations. I know that many members of the House feel strongly that professional footballers' access to this benefit should be explored by the Council. My understanding is that the Council is currently considering any connection between neurodegenerative diseases such as dementia and the possible effects of repeated head injuries sustained as a career as a professional sports person. They need to give further consideration to the evidence before it can make a decision, and will publish its findings when the investigation is complete. So it would be premature for me to speculate on how that will progress, but as I committed a moment ago, I will definitely raise this with my honourable friend, the member for the Disability Minister. Yes.
Again, I'm grateful to the Minister, and I'm also grateful for his remarks, because I think many of us feel that the research is now overwhelming, and I think the role that we can play on a cross-party basis with the assistance of the Minister is really demonstrating to the Advisory Council that an early determination of this really would be welcome, particularly in the light of so many footballers that are experiencing hardship as they struggle with the impact of the brain injuries that they have. And what we can't allow this is just to be dragged out ad nauseum and get to a conclusion and make sure that the footballers get the help that they deserve.
Well, I will try and reflect the right honourable gentleman's comments as accurately as possible with the meeting I have with my right honourable friend, the Minister. I think it's important to also highlight that government is also leading work on brain injuries in sport, specifically around the area of concussion. And As part of this, my department has worked with interested parties to develop the first ever single set of shared concussion guidelines for grassroots sports across the UK, published last April. They were developed by a panel of UK and international experts in the field of sport-related concussion and build on that world-leading work that honourable members have mentioned from Scotland. We remain grateful to Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish colleagues for their support in expanding the remit of the new guidelines to cover the whole of the UK, and therefore use for everyone involved in grassroots sport from school age upwards, and whether that's participants, coaches, volunteers and parents, as well as those working in education settings and healthcare professions. And through these guidelines, we want to encourage more people to enjoy the benefits of being active and playing sport, and we hope that there will be a useful tool in reducing the risks associated with concussion. At all levels of sport, the overarching message is, as my honourable friend mentioned, if in doubt, sit them out, if someone is suspected of having concussion on the field of play. Turning to research, evidence-based research is also a really important component in ensuring that sport is made as safe as possible. And my department has therefore established a research forum to look at concussion in sport. This group brings together key academic experts with experience of traumatic brain injury, neurology and concussion to identify the priority research questions around sports concussion that still need to be addressed for the sporting sector. And the forum is now formulating a report to identify those priority research questions, with the report expected to be completed this year. And alongside this, our department has also established an advisory concussion in sport innovation and technology panel, and the aim of the panel is to identify the tech innovations to help with concussion in sport on an ongoing basis. I should also highlight that the Department for Health and Social Care, of course, is separately formulating the government's new strategy on acquired brain injury, including dementia, and our department is feeding into that process to ensure that those who play sport are represented in that gathering of evidence. And so we remain committed to working with the sector to help sport make sport safe and enjoyable for everyone, and including through technological solutions and in the prevention of concussion. Yes.
Alongside the establishment of new guidelines based on research, which I think everyone will welcome, is the question of enforceability. And there is a sad history in sport of, from anti-doping regulations to other welfare standards not being enforced properly because there's no external validation. And often these policies are executed within team environments, within club environments, by the coaches and the medical staff who report to the coaches with no external supervision. And that's why I think having some external actor that can check the right things are being done will be important to making these new guidelines effective.
I heard my honourable friend's comments very clearly yesterday. I mean, of course, the regulator that we've established for football has a very tight scope, and we've needed to do that. But he raised some interesting points, and I will take those away to consider. But I will certainly be making the point when we convene that round table with all of those interested parties that we really need to see some further work in this area. So, given the time, in conclusion, there is much work, good work going on across government in this area, but I recognise there is more that we need to do, and clearly understand the strength of feeling about this issue and the effects that it has on those who suffer from this terrible illness, as well as their families. And we'll continue to work with the sports sector, including the football authorities, to ensure that player safety is prioritised so that everyone, as I say, can take part in sport safely. And I'd like to thank the honourable member again for securing this debate, and for all of those who are present for their thoughtful contributions and interest in this area. And once I've had that round table, I'll be happy to update honourable members present here today on the outcomes of that discussion.
Thank you, Minister. The question is that this House has considered brain injuries in football. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is suspended until 2:30.